Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Orthodoxy, Autocracy and Nationality, Byzantium Invasion, Anarchy and Iconoclasm. Very lucky to be joined by Marcus. Hello.
Good evening, everyone.
And we have, returning from his illness last week, Columba, and we're very glad that you've made such a speedy recovery.
Yes, the attack on my life has left me deformed.
Yes,
it's great to be back, gentlemen.
But hopefully your resolve is stronger than ever, Columba.
Stronger than ever.
So sorry, guys, for the bit of delay. There are quite a lot of technical problems on our end. I'm having to do this stream crouched over at a windowsill, plugged into the only Ethernet cable in my house. So
like a medieval monk.
Like a medieval. Yes, so we're lucky really to have a stream going at all, given the circumstances. But we'll plug on if that's all right. In terms of like organizing this stream, it's quite complicated. I had quite a lot of difficulty trying to like organize a title and a chronology because there are a lot of things we need to sort of cover in this stream. Of course, the main thrust of this whole series is talking about like the Orthodox Commonwealth and not just the history of Byzantium. So as you know, I'm sure most people are aware, the legacy of Orthodoxy is going to be taken up by the Russian Empire, and there are going to be various Khanates and even Tsardoms established in the Balkan Empire. And so the Slavs become in many ways the spiritual successors to Byzantium. And so we need to sort of establish the Slavs alongside Byzantium. And this is really the period where we have the inception, the rise of the Slavs, so to speak. So I'll try and give a brief like introduction to the origins of the Slavs, and either of you two may jump in and make a contribution or a point whenever necessary. But just for like a brief like archaeological overview. Ethnically, the Slavs are quite interesting because in terms of like our cultures, I mean, on our German stream and on our Gaul stream, which was on Nations of Charlemagne, we were talking about Latin culture and originating around Switzerland. Well, we're talking about the Eastern cultures this time. So we have the Przeworsk culture, which originates around, the west of the Vistula area, which is often associated with the Vandals, which again talks to the Slavs' interesting sort of ethnic history, and that is generally replaced by the Vielbach culture. When it comes to the east, we have the Zarabintsy culture, and as you can see on this map, the left-hand map, the area of this culture is really between the Vistula and the Dnieper rivers. This marshy area of land, which covers modern-day Belarus, which used to be called Pelosi, but it also sort of expands further south, and here we have Chernenyakov culture, which begins to replace Zarabintsy culture. In terms of like the ethnicity of these groups, they're assimilated like many peoples. So we have the Goths, of course, who are the Eastern Germanic group, the Dacians, who were the precursors to the Romanians and the Vlachs today, and Proto-Baltic peoples such as the Latvians and the Lithuanians, and also the Finnic-Ugric peoples who are going to produce the Estonians, the Finnish, and the Hungarians at the same time.
It's no surprise, I suppose. I mean, because we've talked about on the German stream, tribes and peoples coming down the Danube, and one comes and they battle and they settle, and then another one comes, and at this point, east of Germany was still, at least from my knowledge, a very chaotic place, influenced by the steppe. You got constant movements of peoples and what have you. But
yes, more so probably in this region than any other region, because we have the Hunnic invasions throughout the fifth centuries as well. So this almost becomes the area of legend. So the principal sources for this area, so we're talking in the 6th century, are Procopius and Jordanes, and in Getica, Jordanes refers to this area as part of an ancient sort of Visigothic kingdom known as Ulmium, which is actually figures quite generally in a lot of Germanic sagas. But in terms of like how we can like describe these groups, the ramifications of the Hunnic invasion mean there are a lot of different ethnic groups during this region. There isn't you can say a distinct Slavic identity, but I think what's interesting is that despite their genetic makeup from the 6th and the 7th centuries, we have these tribes, as you can see on the west, the Venidi, the Antes, and the Skleveni, who are able to basically act as the progenitors of the, when it comes to the Venedi, the Western Slavs, when it comes to the Sclaveni, the Southern Slavs, as you can see on this, the map on the right, and the Antes become the Eastern Slavs, which then become, the main categories of the groups of the Rus. So yes, very interesting in terms of like where these cultures sort of, in terms of like the archaeology, I think when we have the etymology of the word Slav, the word
I was going to ask you about that.
Yes, the word that Jordanes used was in Getica was spororoi, which basically means the scattered peoples. And this makes sense given the vast sort of layout of these territories, and the fact that we have various hill forts and various like areas, deriving from this culture, this Przeworsk and Zarabensi culture, but there was no sort of consolidated settlement. And I think what's interesting is that whilst I mentioned this general region between the Vistula and the Dnieper, there was very little in the way of any sort of sedentary civilization at this point, in the complete opposite to what you say, the more settled Gallic settlements in modern France.
Is it only during the because this is what I would assume, is it only during the sort of the conquests of the Germans, who push east and Charlemagne and so forth? Is that when we start to see the use of the term Slav? When does the term appear? Because I've heard it's associated with slave or servant, and that would incline me to believe that, because we have a legacy of sort of Germanic domination in this area, and what have you.
I think based on my research, this is really a modern misconception, because the Germans of the Carolingian Empire, so the Franks, refer to them as the Wends, not as the Slavs. When it comes to the actual origin, it's possible that the Slav terminology actually has an actual Slavic origin within their own language, and this has two possible roots. One is Slovo, which means people who speak, which is very appropriate given the common linguistic attributes of the Slavs. And another group is Slava, which basically corresponds to triumphant or glorious. And of course this also moves into Sloveni, which of course is the etymology of the modern word Slovenian, but as a sort of a general assertion for Slavic peoples in their own language. But in terms of ethnicity, I mean, it's a hodgepodge, because they're, as you mentioned, they're lumped between the Germanic groups expanding eastwards, and these are older Germanic groups like the Goths and the Vandals, but also from the nomadic peoples, the Scythians and the Sarmatians, who, as Indo-Iranian peoples, and their legacy is going to be continued by various groups such as the Alans, who last in the Caucasus for a period of time. So all of these cultures sort of mix to create the Slavic identity. In terms of again, a language, this is quite interesting, because they maintain a linguistic unity, which is, from my point of view, it's really quite incredible. Because before the 10th century, you can say that virtually all of the Slav dialects had a maintained linguistic unity and mutual intelligibility. Hence, even when trying to understand, Slavic and, create this idea of a Proto-Slav, even the notion of having a Proto-Slavic group is controversial, because that implies that you have a Proto-Slavic language and then all of these languages that break off. And really that isn't what happens, because there's so little deviation in Common Slavic. And so we have this idea of a Common Slavic language that starts around the year 300 in this area between the Vistula and the Dnieper River. And from 600 onwards, we have the massive expansion of the Slavic populations to what's corresponding into this eastern map here, where they dominate the Balkans. They expand into modern Germany. They expand all the way up until the river Neva in the east. They expand and become the Russians and expand even further. The only area they don't take over is this area in the middle of the Balts, which is consistent of the Lithuanians, the Latvians, but even they have a similar language root. So what's remarkable about these people is, despite their scattered history, despite the repeated conquests, there is this linguistic unity. And in terms of like coming up with a shared archaeology, there isn't even like a unified name for it. And most archaeologists refer to these areas post 5th century to the 8th century as either Penkovka, Kolchin, or Prague cultures emanating around these various regions. But when we go back to the ancient sources, again, there is this division into the Venedi, the Antes, and the Sclaveni peoples, as mentioned in Getica. And this is again the common association going back from the original East Roman sources, that the various breakaway tribes come from these you can say larger tribes.
And I suppose this mixture of languages and cultures and this sort of unification under pressure, if we might hypothesize, you know, such that's as a reason for this unity. We also see a lot of religious uniformity in terms of Slavic paganism. You know, a lot of the names of the same gods are popular, like Chernobog and Perkunos, who is clearly derived from the Indo-European tradition. You know, I mean, he's depicted as sort of, you know, with the thunderbolt smiting. He's the sort of sky father, the Zeus figure, the Thor figure, and so I mean, I couldn't speak so much to non-Indo-European influences in their religion, but I know they're there, and I have heard people talk about the legacy of Hunnic and Eastern religion as well, and it represents this sort of this synthesis between them.
Yes, and I think, you know, this is, you can say, fascinating. Again, just this. I could say if I had to become an archaeologist at some point,
I wouldn't recommend it.
I would probably want to investigate this area more, because it's just the fact that you have a common, as you mentioned, a common polytheistic religion, a common language, despite the fact there's no real common homeland or sort of originator culture or literary tradition. I mean, the Slavs are very late in terms of having their own, even their own alphabet, let alone their own literary culture. And towards the end of the stream, because, you know, the stream is as much a talk about the Slavs as it is a talk about the Byzantines, because the two groups become very intermingled during this time. It's only at the late 9th century that we have the Glagolific and the Cyrillic alphabets, which then become the basis of the you know, the Slavonic Rite and the Eastern literary tradition. So
and we also see is there not some rumor, because, you know, I've been reading Gibbon for this, and there's some rumor that the I think it's the Macedonian dynasty, that their founder Basil was a Slav, I believe. Or yes, they had some Slavic family.
Yes, that wouldn't surprise me, because the Slavs have been I mean, in terms of like their unity, I mean, on the one hand, there isn't some sort of great unity. There isn't like a king or some sort of great cultural homeland. Like the same could be said of Latium with the Romans. But there is quite a lot of consistency within these various tribes, and you can say that these tribes were able to retain their language, retain their customs, retain their political systems, and basically permitted themselves to be dominated by other civilizations, whether that be the Avars, who were one of the great nomadic conquerors targeting Europe during the 6th and the 7th centuries, or whether that be the Romans themselves, because they become they essentially become allied, and some of them convert to Christianity during this period, and some are actually relocated across the empire to bolster the empire's defenses, especially during the reign of,
because I think there was a lot of problems, at least from what I've read, especially in the sort of eastern or oriental departments of the empire. In this period, you see a lot of generals and soldiers who are of basically Parthian descent, you know, or Eastern descent.
Armenian.
And or Armenian, but they're often quite untrustworthy, right? And so, I mean, to me, it sort of smacks of you know, the Romans bringing in the Germans, you know, the emperor bringing in the Germans, because they don't have those same contentions and resentments there. But I mean, that's just my my scant opinion, I suppose.
Well, yes, and the fact that the Byzantine Empire had become like completely deracinated from, you know, its original racial makeup with the gens and the original sort of senatorial class. But in terms of like again, coming up with like an origin story, just before I ask you, Marcus, to weigh in with the reign of Heraclius. The first sort of time we have mentioned again of this spororioi is during the 6th century, and they begin incursions during the reign of Justin, the uncle of Justinian the Great. And as I said, you know, one of the incredible factors of these Slav populations is the fact that they are able to live under domination of various other rulers, and you know, this comes first under the Avars, who occupy the Pannonian Basin, and together both the Avars and the Slavs wage war against the Byzantines. And this is, you know, during the midst of the great Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628, where both empires were fighting each other to sheer exhaustion. The greatest period of total war.
Paved the way for the Muslim conquest as well, right? Because they were just bankrupted.
But this also paved the way for the Slav conquest as well. So in terms of further context, the Balkan region had already been completely devastated thanks to the plague of Justinian. So many of the ancient populations who had dwelt there for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not millennia, namely the Dacians and the Thracians, both of which have become thoroughly assimilated into the Roman culture. Roughly just north of Greece, we have the line delineating Latin culture. So that would be the Thracians and the Dacians, and what would later become the Vlachs and later the Romanian peoples. And then the south of that we have Greek culture. But it's fair to say that both of these indigenous groups were either Latinized or Graecified. But one of the most significant facts in all sort of European history is the fact we have this new group which is able to arrive en masse and cross the Danube during the 7th century and repopulate these areas and take over these areas which had been dominated by the Thracians and the Dacians for as I mentioned, millennia at this point, so much so that they essentially take over all of the interior settlements, of the former provinces of Mysia, etc. And the Romans are pushed to the coastlines. They get as far south as the Peloponnese. In terms of the groups, as I mentioned, this wasn't one consolidated Slavic invasion under one king. Rather, these were all Slavic tribes. So we have Dalmatia occupied by the White Croats and a tribe known as the Gudascani. We have the Serbs occupying during this time. We have the Narentines. We have the Zaclomanians. Various groups who have been lost to history due to these. You can say the process of Slav state building,
and
which
also
occurs.
that doesn't occur at one particular instance either. I mean, we have to consider this is a very gradual movement of people, which occurs roughly, like you said, from the reign of Justinian, the collapse of the Balkan frontier with his investments in the Western Mediterranean, and all the way beyond Heraclius. It's a very gradual movement of Slavs over a relatively long period of time, arguably two or three centuries.
Exactly, and it's facilitated, as you mentioned, the decline of fortifications in the north and the depopulation of these areas. I mean, it basically makes this easy. In fact, it's almost it's incumbent on the Roman emperors to make the best out of the situation, because these are peoples that could potentially be Christianized and used against, you could say, more aggressive and more unified foes, such as the Avars and later the Bulgarians. But in terms of the group that settles in what is now modern Bulgaria in particular, these are a group known as the seven Slavic tribes, and this is going to be the basis for what, again, another process we're going to see throughout this area of history, the Slavification of the Bulgarians. The Bulgarians, of course, are a different ethnic group, although we'll talk about that later. So yes, and of course there were even Slavs in Anatolia during this period. So just to iterate at the beginning, we have this origin story of the Slavs, how despite these localized tribal political bodies, we have this massive cultural and even not sure how to describe it, but this massive cultural invasion, which you can say again defines Eastern European ethnic topography even to this day. I mean, with the exception of the Hungarians, who were able to definitively push the Greater Moravians out in some areas, even though we still have Slavic legacy in the area of what will become the lands of St. Stephen, which is the basis of modern state Slovakia. Most of the old populations have basically just given away to these new conquerors. I mean, the Vlachs, the precursors to the Romanians.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the Romanians, because it's an interesting one, because they have a Latin language, of course.
Yes, they would essentially, they wouldn't be able to operate in consolidated political states up until the late medieval era. I can't remember exactly sort of the century which Wallachia sort of appears, but I think it's very much in the collapse of the First Bulgarian Empire. So we begin to see Vlachian polities emerging in the 2nd century millennium AD. But during this period,
does Vlach turn into Wallachia under
yes,
Vlad the Impaler?
yes,
Oh,
yes.
I see. Very interesting.
Vlach
Yes, exactly.
and Wallachia are basically the same word.
Yeah.
less.
So
One being a
yes.
geographical reference, and one being a ethnic populist reference.
Yes, absolutely. So
Just to
unless
back you up very briefly, AM, just to say, if anyone's actually interested in this particular subject in regards to the Slavic incursions and settlement into Anatolia, into the Balkans, look at the Chronicle of Vasil, because although it's quite wholly disputed in terms of its veracity and whether the details are specifically accurate or not, it references roughly 250 odd years of Slavic incursion and settlement into the Balkans, and essentially covers the quite profound and quite dramatic changes in the demographics of the region, all the way from, like AM was saying, from Moesia, from the Danube, all the way down to the Peloponnese. It's a very extensive reference, and you can take it with a grain of salt, but it's still an interesting read nonetheless.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Marcus. So without further ado, we'll get on to the Byzantine Empire. So I think probably a good place to resume this conversation is by catching up on the state of the Arab conquest at this point. I mean, obviously Heraclius is dead. Heraclius dies in 641, just on the eve of an attempt to reconquer Egypt. And from the beginning, the system of Byzantium is taken over by his very unpopular wife by incest, his niece, Martina. And she tries to put her son, very similar to, you can say, Mustafa and Suleiman the Magnificent, and Hurrem Sultan, her son Heraclius on the throne against the true heir, Constantine III, who is the elder son. And Constantine III leaves the city very quickly and dies under mysterious circumstances. I think, it's pretty obvious that there is very high likelihood that he was murdered by Martina.
Foul play. Yeah, that seems to come up a lot, like with Theophanu later,
Yes. So, but Martina is...
Empress's poisoning? No way.
So Martina is very unpopular, and she is removed very quickly by the 11-year-old son of Constantine III, Constans II. Now, this brings me on to a subject which we left off on the last discussion, talking about the transformation of the Roman Empire into the Eastern Roman Empire, a la Byzantium, which is the creation of the Thermata. Because what's the source of controversy is there's actually very little in terms of written texts during the 7th and the 8th centuries. In fact, most of the sources we have on the 8th century were written during the middle 9th century onwards, when we have the Macedonian Renaissance. But when it comes to the Thermata, the older theory by Ostrogorsky is that they were created during the Great Sasanian War, during the reign of Heraclius. But that theory more or less has been done away with now, and it's assumed that Constans II is responsible for the Thermata. So as our resident Byzantist, Marcus, would you like to elaborate on this? Because I would like to understand how we can have such a, you can say, seismic shift in terms of the administration of the empire and the dissolution of the old provincial system.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, did you want that piece on Heraclius? Because I actually I wasn't able to do it in the previous stream. May I read that paragraph for the audience?
Yeah, sure. Just as an epilogue on Heraclius as we get to the line of Heraclius. Absolutely, sure. Go ahead.
Sure. Arguably the greatest of challenges fell upon the shoulders of an emperor that could be considered the last of an old Latin Rome and the first of a Greek-speaking medieval Byzantium, Heraclius. At this point of Heraclius' achievement, the Prophet Muhammad died in Arabia in 632 AD. The final defeat of Byzantium's most serious enemy coincided with the birth of another. Zoroastrian Persians were replaced by Muslim Arabs. Heraclius was thus not only preoccupied with conducting Roman involvement in the final Byzantine Sassanid War of 602 to 632. His rule and the fate of both his empire and Western civilization broadly would forever and irreversibly so be altered by the emergence of the newly Islamicized Arabs from the vast untamed deserts of Arabia. In the regained provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, the military authorities established by Heraclius after 630 AD were taken by surprise. They were also dismayed by the coherent military challenge of the Arabian tribesmen, whom Muhammad had united after much intertribal warfare. This anticipated invasion, unremittingly aggressive in character and obvious in its ultimate goals, Arab souls were buoyed by the fervor drawn from their newfound faith and unity and fanaticism instilled in them by its dauntless warriors. The death of the Prophet only confirmed the Arabs' determination to spread Islamic domination throughout the known world. The great cities of the Near East fell in quick succession. Damascus in 634, Gaza and Antioch in 637, and Jerusalem in 638. At the Battle of Yarmouk River in northern Syria in 636, Heraclius witnessed a terrible defeat after distressing 5-day-long battle. In 661, the Muslims established their capital at Damascus and begun to launch annual campaigns into Byzantium. The significance and scale of these events are almost beyond imagination to the modern mind. In a single decade, between 632 and 42, the Arabs had occupied Syria, Palestine, and the richest province of Egypt, including the Christian holy place of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. This was a major turning point in Byzantine Roman history. The Arabs had conquered about 2/3 of imperial territory and clearly intended to take the rest. As they pressed on with their expansion across Asia Minor and the coasts of North Africa, in the process they nearly put an end to Byzantium. So this is the situation Heraclius and the empire find itself in. And as AM referenced, we're obviously going to talk about the Thermata and the establishment of the Thermata. This is an empire which in the previous century had endured the Justinian plague and had suffered the reverses of the state as a result of the blood and treasure shed during Justinian's wars. If you fast forward 100 years, we now have the Arab conquest and the tremendous number of defeats suffered at the hands of the Arabs, and this is suffered by both Persia and Byzantium, obviously, but the Persians are unable to resist the Arabs, and the Byzantines eventually do. But the necessity of which the Romans had in reorganizing their state was probably a fundamental component to them actually surviving. And it's with the loss of Africa and the loss of Egypt and the loss of Syria, and Heraclius's quote regarding that is actually quite telling. When they depart from I think it's Emesa, or Antioch, I can't remember which city, but he turns on his horse and says, "Farewell, Syria, what a fine province you shall be for the enemy." These are some of the wealthiest lands in the empire, and they have become Arab territory.
They're not only wealthy materially, though. I mean, this is Antioch. I mean, one of the early birthplaces of Christianity. Jerusalem, of course, the holy city. All of this is lost in a relatively short period of time. And you mentioned the crushing of the Parthians or the Sasanians. It's really interesting. Again, I'm reading Gibbon, and we'll get to we'll get to the Macedonian dynasty. But he actually says that some sources report that so dreadful was the situation in the east that many Parthians actually migrated into the Byzantine Empire, who had been, their greatest foe. And there was a rumor that Vasil, the Macedonian, who also was rumored to have had sort of Slavic blood, it was also rumored that he was descended from the Arsacids, the famous Parthian royal line, which goes all the way back. And so it's very interesting to see this this desperate situation. It doesn't just have immediate consequences in the terms of loss of material wealth and spiritual power and status, but also we see this massive influx of Parthians and Eastern peoples into the empire, which have and they have increasing influence, at least from what I can tell.
Exactly, and there's sort of two parts to that. One, just to specifically reference what you're saying, after the Battle of Firaz, which is quite early, you could call that in the Skirmish phase. This Firaz occurs in 634, and it's actually the one battle where the Sassanids and the Romans fight together against the Arabs in eastern Syria, and the coalition force loses. And I believe the majority of both armies, the surviving portions, retreat into Byzantium because the Arabs have cut the Sassanids off from their homeland. So that sort of reinforces what you're saying, Columbo. And the second thing is that if you believe the historicity of this claim, that the discoverer of Greek fire was a Levantine Greek Christian who had escaped, I think, Antioch and made his way to Constantinople and presented the emperor with this recipe, which ended up being a decisive invention for the nation, for the army.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's basically the medieval equivalent of napalm. Essentially, it gives the Byzantines a definitive tactical edge, especially in naval warfare, and especially
I believe
did
they not they would mount long sort of brass tubes with like a bellows bellows basically on the end of it. They would just spray this stuff on the poor Muslims.
Yeah. And actually, in a way, it's actually superior to napalm, and this is why like modern armies can't work out the recipe, because napalm can be extinguished with normal suppressants, but if both source on both sides, Arab and Turkish, Islamic sources and Christian sources, we believe, Greek fire would actually be fueled by water because of the oxygen content.
Yeah, and it would seem to just it didn't need a particular agent to light it. They would just spray it out of the tube, and it just seems to, light up. So yeah, I mean, they're still not exactly sure what was used. Yeah,
we could almost call it like a Dark Age or medieval period kind of Wunderwaffe in some ways,
Yeah, no, the secret was guarded pretty zealously for a long time.
Well, they say that the last thing that the Mega Stux, who was before the city, what was his name? Lucas Notaras. The last thing he did before the city fell was burn the recipe, allegedly.
Oh, I like that story.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's true, but if it's true, then awesome.
So so moving on, I think that's quite a good starting point to talk about the reign of Constans II, inviting this disaster. So can you explain how the Thermata, the organization, was actually able to help the empire during this time, why it was superior to the old provincial system?
Well, in some ways, if you look at the Roman response to the Arab invasions, in part, and we have to take into consideration too that the provincial system has taken an absolute shellacking at the hand of the last Roman Sassanid War, and then with these initial Arab conquests, this long-standing infrastructure and bureaucratic organization is destroyed. Forget within a generation, it's destroyed within a decade, and you got to think how old these institutions are, and how old some of these bureaucratic frameworks are, and indeed they may have evolved under Diocletian, under Constantine, under Theodosius. There may have been tweaks and changes, and Heraclius himself obviously brings bureaucratic changes by changing the empire from a Latin-speaking state to a Greek-speaking state, and he would have made changes of his own. But the mass kind of subdividing of the empire under Diocletian works against it now, because there's no one region that is actually able to, how can I say, gather and marshal sufficient strength to block the Arabs at any point. And if you look at some of the disasters in North Africa, for instance, let's say when Gregory attempts to turn back the Arab incursion into North Africa at the battle of the battles of Tripoli and Sufatulia in 642, 643, he simply doesn't have enough sort of authority jurisdiction to be able to bring to bear the full might of his provinces, despite him being an exarch of North Africa. And
so the question I would ask you is why you would do this, how the themes make it more effective, is who was chosen who governed the province systems, and who governed the thematic system, I guess you could say, because I know that later on, in the later period of the themes, they were many of them were governed by eunuchs, perhaps, who were seen to be less of a threat or what have you. So in this early period when they were established, do we see a shift in governance of who was in charge here, or is it just the structure?
Well, the thing is, it's to sort of simplify this conversation. What we essentially have is a reconsolidation of provinces, right? They're not quite as large as what they were, say, in the Roman Empire of the first century under Vespasian, or say Trajan or Hadrian. They're not quite so large, but they're definitely much larger than they were in the post-Diocletianic, post-Tetrarchic period. There's this sort of gradual, or not gradual, but there's this sort of more or less integration and consolidation of these small provinces back into larger territories. And some of them are commanded by a comes, which is a Greek translation roughly amounting to a count. Yeah. The border territories, take for instance, if you look at a map of the early Thermata from say 780, you have territories say as Lykandos, or the eastern portion of the Armeniac theme, or I think this might also apply to the naval theme, where they're actually governed directly by a strategos, which is a general, more or less. It's of such military necessity and vulnerability that they're directly governed by a general. And so, and also there's, we talked about in the previous stream how Diocletian, in order to sort of stop this revolving door of rebellion and usurpation, separated military and civilian authority and responsibility, there's a partial, not entire, but there's a partial reintegration of those roles, so that whoever's governing that province has the ability to marshal the greater part of that province's strength to counter enemies at a more proximal positioning to where the enemies may be or are in fact at that given point in time.
So it's in many ways, you can say it's the creation of all these little imperators, these little military commands who are able to respond tactically to any threat. And I think in terms of like the organization, I haven't got it on this map here, but the principal thematas were, of course, almost entirely established around the region of Anatolia. So when we have the consolidation of the new empire, Anatolia becomes the principal source of manpower for the empire and the source of its political strength for the economy. Of course, this process isn't uniform because we still have the Exarchate of Ravenna, we still have the Exarchate of Africa. And just moving on to this conversation about defeat, the Arabs, of course, attack the Exarchate of Africa, and by the end of the sorry, Marcus, I think there's a bit of my voice coming through. Thanks. By the end of the 7th century, we have the loss of North Africa. And I think what I find remarkable, in addition to this, we have the creation of this new Roman system of administration, is, again, just the scale of defeat. Not only are these the two richest provinces, so we're talking about Egypt and Africa. Africa, of course, had retained its strength when it had been part of the Vandalic kingdom. Both of these regions were, the breadbaskets of the empire as well. So we have this massive food shortage, which is brought on by the loss of these territories. I think a question I want to ask you, Marcus, whilst we have the adoption of Greek fire on the one hand, which is a considerable decisive strategic advantage to the Byzantine navies. On the other hand, we have this very rapid loss of Byzantine naval supremacy, which had been established in the wake of the conquest of Belisarius. So I just wonder how, for example, Cyprus was able to be ravaged very quickly during the 650s. So I just wonder, how is it that the Arabs were able to create a navy so quickly and were able to attack the Byzantine Empire, everywhere, and win decisively?
This is yet another case of history rarely repeats itself, but quite often rhymes. And we spoke in the earlier stream, I think it was in this series actually, when we spoke about the Persian-Greek wars and the battles of the naval battle of Salamis, and how the Persians were able to build a fleet once they had conquered the Lydian and the sort of Neo-Babylonian Empire, and had access to the shipyards that had been previously built by the Phoenicians, who were themselves conquered by the Babylonians, or maybe the Assyrians. But that knowledge and those facilities existed in the Levant when the Persians took them.
Really?
And this would, pardon?
No, I just find that fascinating, because that was something that came to my mind, was this continuity of the Phoenician, Tyre, Sidonese naval tradition. But the fact it was able to endure so long beyond any existence of a Phoenician state is remarkable.
Oh, it did. Even I can say that once they took Africa with their newfound naval power, that was what allowed them to push on to Sicily.
Well, what I was saying was that that was what helped the Persians back then. But
right.
what would help the Arabs in this instance is that, although it wasn't necessarily a Phoenician Levantine shipbuilding tradition as existed in 400, 460, 380 BC, these shipyards were still utilized by the Romans to maintain the eastern portion of the imperial navy.
Yeah.
Cities such as what would be the Crusader capital of Acre, Tripoli, as in Levantine Tripoli, not North African Tripoli, Antioch, modern day Iskenderun, which is Alexandria, although a smaller port. But these places would be important ports for the Roman navy, to house fleets, to refit ships, to rest crews, etc. Alexandria is actually another obvious example, and possibly Damietta, which is also in Egypt, and the Arabs inherit these. And so, much like the Persians stumbled across them when they conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Arabs, when they conquer these Roman provinces through the decade, from 636 to 646, themselves stumble across these shipbuilding facilities and this shipbuilding culture and this understanding of seafaring and ship construction, which, like the Persians before them, use that to their advantage. And I think also because the Romans were so shocked by these quite sudden defeats and this sort of enormous, what would have felt like a like I wrote in my essay, this sort of zealous wave of Arabs pouring out of the desert, the Romans, with their limited resources, would have spent more money on refitting armies and levying troops and, essentially constructing more weapons and arms and armor for their infantry. And the navy probably would have been slightly neglected at this point. I don't know that for certain. This is just me surmising. But I think we might have touched on this at the end of the last room. I can't remember, but the battle off the coast of southern Anatolia, is it the battle what they call of 1,000 sails or 100 sails? I can't remember what the name is, but it happens, I think, during the reign of Constans II. And the Arabs absolutely annihilate the Byzantine fleet. And the one superiority they had over the Arabs is now gone, which leads up to the first siege of Constantinople. And so the Byzantines are at wit's end as to how to defeat the Arabs, because they can't best them on land. And now the one tool that they did have over them, which was the navy, was sent to the bottom of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yes, and I think just moving on that, just to get us to the siege, really the conquest continues unabated until the year 656. That's when we have the reign of Halif Ali. For those of you who don't know, Ali in the Shia tradition is known as the first Imam. Within the Sunni tradition, he's known as the fourth Halif, or Deputy of God. This triggers a civil war within the empire, which lasts 5 years, and we see the eventual replacement of the original caliphate, or the Rashidun Caliphate, with the Umayyad Caliphate. But this is a very short respite, because even though we have this seismic civil war, the Umayyads continue and accelerate these conquests even further, unabated for the next 100 years. I think what I find most remarkable researching this topic was that Constans II actually withdrew from Constantinople, and he resituated his capital. I think it was in Syracuse, in
Syracuse,
Sicily.
yeah.
Yes, in Sicily during this
because
point.
he wanted to be able to fight off the predations coming from Africa, I believe.
So yes, I find again just and also I think he was very quickly under reputation as a tyrant, which resulted in his assassination after only staying there for some 6 years.
But Syracuse has such a wonderful tradition.
Yes, it's a wonderful tradition.
I was going to say another case of history rhyming. Syracuse and tyrants, surely not. Another point just to mention, actually, because Carthage, and apologies for the previous stream, because I, in my notes, wrote Abbasids rather than Algabids, and I completely got myself mixed up date-wise. So apologies to AM and the viewers last week. But just on Carthage, actually, it's captured in 695, essentially guaranteeing the conquest of the Maghreb by the Arabs. But the Romans actually launched a naval counterattack and recaptured the city, much like what they did with Alexandria. And they recaptured Carthage 2 years later in 697. Although the Arabs eventually take it in 698 again, that counterattack is launched from Sicily. And that was, I think, a part of the logic of why Syracuse was chosen as the capital for that brief period of time, because of its proximity to Africa, and also because of its proximity to, if there was going to be any greater counterattacks to, say, Cyrenaica or to Cyrene or what have you, it would be a good place to do it. But that never eventuated.
And I think it was at that same time that they took Crete as well, right? I think so.
Crete is taken slightly later. Yeah.
Okay.
Crete and Cyprus are both lost in 653, basically with the first fleets that the Arabs built.
All right. Sorry, I got confused. I thought Crete was taken a little later. But in terms of Constance, I think there's also the idea that Constantinople itself was, directly under the sword of Damocles when it came to the Slavic groups. As you can see on this map, Constantinople is basically everything west of it. Everything west of the modern city of Edirne, then Adrianople, is basically taken by the enemy. So again, I wonder the logic of removing from Constantinople, especially when it's a very precarious political situation you're put in whenever the capital is vacated. But Constans, is assassinated, as we mentioned, in 668, and he's replaced by Constantine IV, who is, again, probably the only successful Heraclian emperor post Heraclius. And, of course, he's most famous for defeating the Arabs at the first Arab siege of Constantinople from 674 to 678. And, again, this is largely reliant on Greek fire, which, gives them the edge. And, again, an edge I don't believe they had at the Sasanian attack on the city in 626. But this victory, this great victory, which earns Constantine IV a huge amount of prestige, and I think is a major morale point, especially as everything before then had been going against them. We have the arrival of this new enemy to the north, which is going to play a fundamental role in the history of Orthodox civilization moving forward, which is the rise of the Bulgars. And just a quick introduction before we get into this this same period of history again.
Just before you go on, may I just bookend the theme thing very quickly, just in regards to troops specifically?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I mentioned that the themes themselves would be led by either, in most instances, a comes, or in the rare instances of the very dangerous border provinces, strategos. A part of this also was to create a sort of segregation between, so you have the Thermata, which were sort of troops levied in the themes, and they're not levies in the same way as we might imagine in the West of being, pardon me, like a Saxon third, or a Frankish Heerban. But these are at the very least semi-professional troops, and they're highly motivated because they are defending the area they come from. They are, at least in part, armed and armored by the state. They are formed into, to use the Greek word, taxies, which are sort of, you could translate modern day regiments or battalions, but no different to, say, a Roman cohort. They're organized, and they have officers. They're sort of very legitimately semi-professional. They would at least be considered a reservist in a modern army context. And then, and what's sort of strange is that the Targuma, which is the professional corps, is in fact referenced earlier. I don't have a copy of Maurice's Strategicon, but he actually references the Targuma and the establishment of professional troops in Constantinople prior to the rule of Heraclius. And you have these Targuma, which are levied from the best troops, either of the themes or from within the larger cities, being in this case Thessalonica, Constantinople, and prior to the invasions of the Arabs, it would have been also Alexandria and Antioch. And these form a centralized corps which go where the emperor goes and defends the capital. And then, depending whether the emperor attacks east or west or south or what have you, they would be reinforced by the Targuma. And the logic of that was you would have this highly professional, disciplined, well-trained corps of troops that would go where either the emperor dispatched them or the emperor himself went. And then along the way on campaign, as he traveled through the various themes, would pick up these semi-professional troops on the way. So by the time they got to a point in battle where the enemy was, not only would the frontier forces be keeping them in place, kind of like how the Limitani Repensis worked in the Constantinian era, but then this force would arrive collecting troops on the way at the point where the enemy was, and would have a greater prospect of defeating them, rather than relying, as Heraclius would have done, dispatching a massive force from the capital every time there was a crisis. Or then once big cities got picked off, as happened in the early stages of the Arabs' invasions, there were no capability of reinforcement and no local leadership. So the theme, by and large,
never mind
addresses
reinforcement. I mean, you wouldn't have been able to feed them.
Exactly.
I mean, it's much easier to marshal forces this way. Yeah,
exactly. So the theme system, by and large, addresses that, and I hope that explains it, AM, because that's about what I know of the themes, because sadly there are a number of different schools of thought, and some of them are rather contradictory. So that's the best I can pick from it.
Yes, I think that's very conclusive. Thank you, Marcus. From a military point of view, and again, this is the transition away from these urban centres towards more agricultural levies, essentially. Which this process, as we discussed in our last stream on the series, had begun during the crisis of the 3rd century AD. But I think just one addendum to that discussion is that there isn't this fragmentation, this feudal fragmentation of the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, which occurs in the West. Simply because the organization of these themata or territorial units, essentially they could have been broken off into kingdoms, as you said, but they don't, because the Byzantines operate on the system known as planoia, which is that essentially all of this land is vested in the integrity of the state, and that the emperor, this is, you can say, the continuation of the the Roman Republic in many senses. The emperor still offers occupies a a distinguished office, as the first sort of religious magistrate and the first sort of military officer of the realm, but it's not his domain in the same sense that we see like a dynastic entity such as the Carolingian Empire moving onward. This idea of the continuing institutions of Rome, and this idea of Rome as greater than one individual dynasty is a continuous fact throughout this history, and I think this is exhibited in the fact that Thermata don't break off and they remain true to the empire, and we don't see this appanage system or this feudal fragmentation to smaller and smaller polities. How despite the empire shrinking, the empire itself remarkably is able to hold itself together. But just getting onto the rise of the Bulgars, if I may, I think what's interesting about this is, again, this is an example of the Slavification of you can say almost like a precursor to the Ottomans, if you want, the first Turkic invaders, establishing a major presence in the Balkans. The Bulgars are one of the first sort of great settled peoples. In terms of like their origin, there's still again a lot of controversy regarding the origins. The first sort of mention of them is as allies of the Eastern Romans against the Goths in around the year 480. In terms of like coming up with an origins, one etymology for the word Bulgar means mixed, and a lot of people have taken this to mean mixed race, but it's much more likely that it means mixers or disunifiers or troublesome, and this would be consistent if we take their one of the most popular origins is that they come from a tribe of Turks known as the Uyghurs, which are possibly linked to the Huns, and within that, the Bukut tribe of the Uyghurs, and possibly, coming from the modern Xinjiang region with the Uyghurs in modern-day China, or that they were potentially the Bulakiai, one of the 5 barbarian groups, according to Chinese sources during that time, remnants of the great Zhongnu Confederation, which is again consolidating this link with the origin of the Huns of which was supposed to be a Western fragmentation of the Zhongnu as well. So yes.
So I assume that these were horse steppe people again in the tradition of the Hungarians.
As you can see on this map on the left hand side, most of these people are the line sort of emanating from Kazakhstan, and the assumption is that before then they're coming from East Turkestan or Xinjiang region today. So they're migrators, and they originally again beginning as not so much mercenaries, but tribal groups who invariably sometimes ally with the Romans against the Goths, or ally against the Goths and the Romans. But Jordanes again makes the explicit connection with the Bulgars having some sort of link to the Huns, etc. But in terms of like establishing a state, during the steppe at this time, we have the great sort of Western Huns under Attila. We have the Eastern Huns, or the White Huns, or the Hephthalitic Empire, which then moves on towards the Great Turkish Khaganate, which is established around 550. But this begins to fragment quite quickly, and by the 650s or so, there is a Western Khaganate, which Khaganate just means Khan of Khans, or basically it's the nomadic equivalent of an emperor. And this system begins to fragment, and the first sort of notion of a Bulgarian, or sort of not Bulgarian so much as a Bulgar identity, is established under Kubrat, who creates the old Great Bulgarian. As you can see on this map, the area basically corresponding to the Turkish steppe, the Pontic steppe, as we see here in the south, is the origin for the first sort of unification of the Bulgar peoples, etc. Someone, Dave Bergson, saying in the chat, in terms of like a Turkish tribe, again, it's either they come from the Uyghurs, who have links with the Huns, but again, as we mentioned, the actual ethnic composition of the Bulgarians, there's no established, in terms of their language, they had a Proto-Turkish language, which is, again, you can say is a continuity from their link with the original Great Turkish Khaganate during the 6th century. In terms of their, the origin, the ethnic origin, this goes, further down, but in terms of the language that they spoke was some form of Turkish. That's where we get the title of Bulgar. Old Great Bulgaria, doesn't last very long. It's conquered by the famous Jewish Khazar Khaganate, and it's broken up into various tribes. And as you can see in this map, some of them move further north, and they establish the Volga Bulgarians. And this little enclave, converts to Islam, and it's able to, later resist the Muslim conquest. And stays here for around the next 400, 500 years. Another group invades the Danube. It crosses over Bessarabia, as you can see on this map, led by a Bulgarian chieftain known as Asparuk. And this is where we enter, sort of connect again the Bulgars back to the story of the Eastern Roman Empire, because they cross over the Danube and encounter various Slavic tribes, the 7 Slavic tribes, which I alluded to when talking about the rise of the Slavs, and they begin again to form a confederation with the Slavs and dominate the Slavs in a very similar fashion to the way that the Avars had done, a century before. And we have the first major military engagement in 680, which is when Asparuk defeats Constantine IV at the Battle of Ongal, just a couple of years after the decisive Byzantine victory against the Arabs at the Siege of Constantinople.
I think it's fascinating, because if we consider, of course, the Ottoman conquests and attempts in the Balkans centuries later, it's just it's really intriguing to see that Turkic inroads had been made so much earlier.
But again, it depends.
From the opposite end of the Danube.
Yes, exactly, from the north, as opposed to from Bithynia, from the Anatolian side. So yes, and of course they were pagan at the same time. But I think what's remarkable is that the Byzantines give up very quickly. I mean, as we already showed in the previous map, the empire had been basically disintegrated in the Balkans, and only a few cities such as Thessalonica and Athens were still part of the empire at this point. So rather than fighting back, Constantine acknowledges the loss, recognizes the Bulgarian conquest, and even pays tribute to Asparuk. And from Bulgarian sort of national history, this is decided as the beginning of the Bulgarian Empire, even though from a political point of view, the Bulgarians, or the Bulgars, are retaining their identity, their Hunnic or Turkic identity, their language, but the Slavs are being ruled by them, but they too are retaining their tribal organization, the 7 tribes of the old province of Mysia. So when we talk about this notion of Bulgarian as distinct from Bulgar, it's really owing to a lot of different ethnic groups. On the one hand, we have the Bulgars, from which the name is taken, and who were the conquerors of this region and provided, the dynasty of Khans and later Tsars. But we also have the local Thracians who, were still there, even though severely depopulated. And we have the Slavic tribes as well. And so when we talk about a Bulgarian identity, it's the assimilation of all these tribes.
How long was it after this tribute was paid until we see Christianization? How long did they retain their pagan practices? Well,
the Christianization of Bulgaria is kind of like the end point of this stream. So the actual date is when Tsar Boris converts the court of Pliska in 864. So from 681 until 864, we have pagan domination during this region. And just a note on Christianization, I think it's the Croatians and some of the Serbs who convert first. Of course, the Croatians would convert to the Latin rite rather than the Byzantine rite. But no, these groups would dominate these populations and result in a major influx of pagan influence in this region, right up until the 9th century. And as we'll talk about later, it's really Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius who are responsible as the apostles to the Slavs of bringing Christianization here. But without further ado, we've established the perennial foe of the Byzantine Empire to its north, and the Arabs, of course, to its south and to its east. Now we get to the anarchy portion of this conversation, which is the 20 Years Anarchy, and we get to probably one of my favorite emperors. If any of you sort of are aware of the history of this channel, I first got on YouTube talking to Academic Agent about Justinian II with his bronze nose, who he kept claiming was some sort of reason why the Byzantines weren't really Romans because of this. But this is the emperor himself.
God's sake,
This is the emperor himself, Justinian II, who I hate to reference Game of Thrones because I know it's basically destroyed any of its cultural capital after the disastrous end of the series. But Justinian II is real Mad King, if there ever was one in real life. But there are quite a lot of themes beginning with Justinian II, which I'd like to continue over. I mean, something I didn't mention about Constantine IV, the last effective Heraclian emperor, was that he was able to resolve quite a lot of the religious disputes between the monophyleticism, which had been the movement or compromise movement born out of again, the compromise by Heraclius, that had basically been solved during yet another church council. But when we have Justinian II, the reign starts off quite well. We have various defeats of the Slavs in Macedonia. He's crowned emperor in Thessalonica after a very effective campaign in the first couple of years of his reign. He, accompanied his father on various military campaigns and distinguished himself, and renews a peace treaty with the Umayyads, confirming this border in the east, around the Taurus Mountains and the Armenian highlands. However, from about 691 onwards, Justinian II begins to raise taxes, and to augment, his armies at this point. His policy had been basically to take these, Slavic tribes, which he had just reconquered, reassimilated back into the empire, and begin to redistribute them during various unpopulated territories in order to act as a natural levy. Well, in response to Justinian's attempt to raise tax, the Slavs, which he positioned in Bithynia, modern-day Turkey, rose against him. And Justinian, basically called for the entire extermination of all the Slavs in Bithynia in response to this. To make matters worse, the next year, he basically undid all of his father's you can say religious mediation by imposing these draconian prescriptions known as the 102 canons of the Quinisect Council, the Fifth and Sixth Councils, which, among other things, call for the excommunication of anyone who mentions the name of a pagan god, such as Bacchus or Dionysus, excommunicates a woman for curling in her hair in a way that looks seductive, and it also, I believe, offered a prohibition on dancing as well.
So is this basically like Byzantine thought patrol that he's doing, or?
Yes, it is. It's glorious. I wonder if the ban on dancing was trying to hark back to an earlier Roman, because I know that the Roman patricians were meant not to dance. It was unmanly.
Also, what's interesting, because if you think of his namesake, I can't remember if we mentioned this at the Justinian stream, because I did have a quote, an anonymous quote that pertained to Justinian as a Justinian I, but he, especially in his later life, he became more sort of religiously orientated, passed a lot of edicts during his reign, basically cutting down on gaming and gambling in the city.
Yeah,
he actually passed an edict to have gay men in the empire, and certainly in Constantinople, actually to be castrated. Yeah. And I wonder if, in a slightly different way, Justinian II maybe took a leaf from his namesake in that regard, because it has that same kind of almost insane puritanical kind of bent to it. You know what I mean?
And of course, Justinian, the one who married the famous courtesan Theodora. Let's not forget that. And we, of course,
he's a real paragon of virtue himself.
If we believe Procopius' secret history as well, I think that's even more interesting. But that's a lot of dispersions on that source. But nevertheless, yes, indeed. I think this constant association with Justinian II is, trying to live up to his namesake. Yes, I think that's fairly obvious. But one of the effects of this is that the clergy are basically terrified of him. On the one hand, you can say they're terrified because basically he's fighting a corruption campaign in the clergy itself. Yet on the other hand, you can say that this is, very draconian, and this is going to alienate and cause a rupture within society. So the Pope is actually one of the again principal factors, opposing these 102 canons, and even so much it causes a rebellion within the Exarchate of Ravenna, and nearly the death of the then Exarch Zacharias. But in response to this, Justinian again supposedly goes through one of his bouts of total insanity, and these will just intensify as we go on. And one of these bouts of insanity supposedly called for the potential death of the then ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Callinicus. And in response, in 695, a disgruntled soldier, Leonidas, supported by Callinicus and the blue faction within the imperial hippodrome, stages a coup against Justinian II. And here we have the ritual cutting off the nose known as rhinocopia. And just, for a little bit of context, before we have, the creation of the death penalty as like a standard instrument of punishment throughout all of this, as you mentioned, Columba, we have ritual castration, and again importing these people into the eunuch system, and we see that in continuity with the various harems of the Turkish court later on, and later the Topkapi Palace within the Ottoman Empire. We also have ritual blinding, which was basically seen as a more humane way of getting rid of a rival and dispossessing them of any sort of military capacity. But also you have the rhinocopia, or the ritual mutilation of the nose. But this doesn't end very well for the empire, as we'll work to discuss. Leonidas is removed from power pretty quickly, and Tiberius III comes in very quickly, and he too is removed whilst he's out on campaign against the Muslims. And just for like context of what Justinian II is doing here, for 10 years he'd been exiled in Phanagoria, which on this map you can see there's a little bit of purple at the tip of Crimea, which is around the old city of Curzon, which is nowadays Simferopol.
It's an ancient place of exile. People
yes,
were exiled there in the Principate.
Yes, exactly, because it was the oldest, again, Greek continuous kingdom, the kingdom of Panticapaeum, and a client state as well.
And to use the Greek terminology, they, especially in the later Byzantine era, they called it a perite, which basically means the land
beyond,
over there.
Beyond the sea, yes.
Beyond the sea, yeah.
Yes. So he was exiled to this little area known as Phanagoria, which is the modern-day Taman Peninsula, just opposite the end of Crimea, where it enters the Sea of Azov, the little sea in the eastern corner. And he's basically there as a guest of the Khagan of the Khazars, and he even marries, I believe, the daughter of the Khagan. Nevertheless, there is an attempt to assassinate him in 704, and this leads him to form an alliance with the Bulgars, again bringing them back into the story, shortly after the defeat of his father. And it's actually the Bulgars who are instrumental in restoring him to the throne. And the thumbnail of this video, of course, is Justinian paying the Khan of the Bulgars for the privilege of having restored his throne to him. Essentially, he does so by sneaking into the city and proclaiming himself emperor through one of the crevices, whilst the emperors on campaign. And this is when we have the 6 years of continuous revenge, which he unleashes, which really solidifies his notion as the original sort of Eastern Roman mad emperor. He has a ritual stoning of his predecessors, Leonidas, who have been able to survive his usurpation, and Tiberius III, and then their execution. We have the blinding of the former patriarch Kallinicus, and we have, more importantly, the purging of the army of its most effective commanders, including Heraclius, Tiberius's brother. And then we have, again, these completely nonsensical episodes, like these military incursions, which were basically vengeance incursions. So we have the excursion to the Exarchate Ravenna, who had, as we mentioned, objected to his 102 canons and the Quinisext Council. And in response, he comes into the city through duplicity, sacks the city, murdering most of its population, and sends most of its officials back to Constantinople to be executed, most of whom had actually been loyal to him. Probably the only effect of this was that the Pope was forced, at the end of a sword, to accede to the 102 canons. And then you have an even more insane episode, which he comes back, and his former host, the Khagan of the Khazars, had attacked this little tip at the end, the tip of Curzon. And rather than launching military campaigns against the perennial enemies, the Bulgarians, his former allies, or the Arabs, he decides to launch 2 military campaigns to reclaim this tiny little area at the tip of Crimea. One of the first attempts, he arrives in the city and basically massacres the population, drowns them, uses his army to drown most of the denizens for treachery, and sends most of the Khagan's officials down again to Constantinople to be executed.
Doesn't he enslave a lot of the women and children as well? Yes,
exactly. But to make it matter, in terms of, again, militarily, it's insignificant. I think you can say, in terms of revenge, you can say, this man was my former ally and he's attacking my former possessions. But nevertheless, it's quite unhinged because there's very little strategic value. And again, attacking the population of your own former city,
not very pragmatic.
Not very pragmatic. And to make matters worse, the fleet he sent was destroyed again. And, not content with having done that, he sends another fleet, because the city, of course, rebels very quickly, not satisfied with those state of affairs. And it's led by the ecumenical patriarch Maurus. Maurus, rather than wanting to see through this expedition, decides to ally with another disaffected soldier, which there are so many throughout Byzantine history, Philippicus, to depose Justinian, who was in Armenia at that time. And Justinian, after he was, found and eventually executed, and his probably the only tragic element of this was that his son was butchered whilst trying to seek religious sanctuary. In order for the new emperor,
he held onto the cross and he had his arm chopped off.
Yes, exactly. Yes, the part of the true cross, I think.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So no, that was a pretty horrific sign. But I think Justinian II, I think it's quite obvious he earned his death. But when we have, the execution, his head is quickly sent to Ravenna and Rome by Philippicus to quickly bring that territory, which had been, so ravaged by Justinian's, revenge expeditions back into the fore. Nevertheless, we have this period from 711, which is after his death. I think, again, just a final note, that he is the last Heraclian emperor. And as we mentioned, with the death of the son, it was the extermination of this dynasty, so they could never be restored again, as Justinian II had been restored again, thus ending the reign of the noseless mad emperor. But we have 6 years when there are 3 emperors on the throne: Philippicus, Anastasius II, and Theodosius III. Sorry, and this is where we have, you could say, the lowest ebb for the empire again. Justinian II had wasted all these resources on these ridiculous campaigns, and he'd cut off the head of the army by killing off so many of its more competent officials. And finally,
this is also this is the first proper step on the road to alienation between the Pope and the West and the East, right? With the increasing sort of autocracy of the East, and then once we get to Leo the Isaurian, it really kicks off.
Yes,
also, I was just going to say, also as a reference sake too, it's during the reign of Tiberius and Leontios where that the eventual loss of Africa has also occurred during the period between Justinian II's first and second reign. So, like you say, rather than attending to the needs of the empire, he's partaking in these rather sort of petty, punitive expeditions that are of no consequence to the fate of the empire.
I know, it's ridiculous, isn't it? But I think Columba has made a very good point, which is a point I agree with, that it's not iconoclasm that really starts this, you could say, the disintegration of relations between the Pope and the Emperor. It's Justinian II, and you can say that Justinian II's canon, 102 canons, was also a precursor to the iconoclastic controversy, where you have these various moralizing missions by the Emperor, which have the effect of alienating most of the clergy from the more autocratic assumptions of the Emperor. The irony being, of course, that the earlier Heraclians had actually done a lot to try and mend a lot of the religious controversies during this time. But here we have the Assorian Dynasty, and in a similar manner to the first Arab invasion, Leo III is able to dispatch the forces of Caliph Suleiman using principally Greek fire, even though I think it's important to note that the Byzantines were aware that the siege was coming for a long time. And so even during the reign of Anastasius II. So the city had been preparing for a long siege and was, much more aggressively and effectively able to take on the Arabs, this time actually with Bulgarian reinforcements. Again, they periodically switch allegiances between the two, and this time they're fighting alongside the empire rather than, as the Slavs originally come into the story, helping the Sasanians attacking Constantinople in 626. But Leo is, again, very significant because we have this military victory, which establishes, like Constantine IV, his personal prestige. And then the empire undergoes a system of reorganization. So we have, these various alliances with various Slavic settlers helping to, rebuild the manpower base for the army. And, within Leo's own reign, what the great sort of victory to consolidate this against the Arabs is the Battle of Akronon in 740. But as you mentioned, Columba, we have this aggressive conversion campaign towards various groups, again, a la Justinian II. So we have in 722 the forced baptism of the Jews and many heretic groups. And from 626 until 729, we have the iconoclastic degrees. And in terms of, again, the clerical opposition to this, the then Patriarch of Constantinople, Germanos, resigns in disgust at this, and Gregory II of the Pope at that time, basically anathematizes the iconoclasts. He considers it, such a horrific heresy in terms of, again, the division between the Pope and the Eastern Roman Emperor, and again, how this is not a church-led movement. This is very much an imperial-led movement. This is the autocrat imposing his conception of the true religion on the empire at the expense of the clergy. And there are many sorry,
I was just going to ask, because I would say, I mean, you mentioned Gregory, and I read Gibbon includes Gregory's letter to the emperor, and I was just wondering if, because it seems to me that it's at this time that the Pope, as a sort of spiritual emperor, if you will, that this conception is solidified and strengthened in reaction to the iconoclasm and the autocracy of the Eastern emperors. But what I would ask is, were there currents of this idea of the Pope being a spiritual authority to rival the emperor before this, or did this really just get going now?
No, I think it's important to realize that the Pope is constantly having these struggles with the emperor. Basically, whenever the emperor keeps the Pope out of a particular religious council, the Pope will respond by declaring the council invalid, and this happens repeatedly. So the idea is that the Pope is content so long as he's brought in and he's made a formal part, as along with the entire episcopacy, all of the various patriarchs, and again, most importantly, outside of the Pope, the Patriarch of Constantinople, they're brought in, and there's this unity between the emperor and the various principal bishoprics. But in terms of the Pope as a spiritual power, the idea of a Pope as a spiritual power, it goes back, biblically, all the way to Jesus investing Saint Peter as the nominal head of the church, and the idea that the See of Rome is superior to all other sees, even though the See of Jerusalem under James, nominally you could say was more pivotal during the early conversion, but
quite literally the rock upon which he will build his church.
Yes, precisely. That's yes, Peter.
Hence in Italian, the name Pietro is also the Italian word for rock.
Well, yes, Peter does mean rock, and his name was changed from Simon to Simon Peter, and Peter meaning rock. So again, the idea of Peter as the foundation of the church is explicitly mentioned in scripture. But in terms of the actual political application of this, it really manifests during this time. And I think, again, it's also exacerbated by the emperor's tenuous holding over the city of Rome itself, and the fact that, as we discussed, the Exarchate of Ravenna is in a state of disarray. We have constant Lombard attacks, and the Pope is not just looking for a ideological or spiritual ally in the emperor, he's also looking for a protector. And the emperor has failed, repeatedly with that duty. And so towards, after the reign of Leo, we have the Pope gravitating towards
Franks and the West.
Yes, there's more than that. I think what's important, because I'll just try and summarize this at one point before I get onto iconoclasm regarding the popes. The popes had a lot of dioceses directly under their purview within the Byzantine Empire. So the Thermata of Sicily, many of the dioceses in the south were under papal supervision. Dioceses in Greece itself were under papal supervision. And not only does Leo III, launch this iconoclastic fury, but he also removes these dioceses from the direct purview of the Pope, therefore limiting his control to Italy itself, which means the Pope has very little interest in maintaining an alliance with an Eastern Roman emperor who has dispossessed him of all this authority within the empire. So when he cuts off his link with the empire, when he crowns, when the Pope crowns Charlemagne in 800, he has very little to lose, because he's already lost so much of his influence due to this autocratic Assorian dynasty, which has paid no heed to its, iconodule, sympathies, the papal iconodule sympathies, but also the fact that in terms of the actual temporal possessions of the Pope himself, they have been severely reduced by the Assorian dynasty. So it's a two-pronged attack on the Pope, which again, you can almost say leads to desperation, where we have the severing of the Byzantine papacy and the beginning of the Carolingian papacy. But back to there was an attempt. I think it's important to know that Leo didn't accept this lying down. He did lead a naval expedition towards the end of his reign, but this fails. And basically after that, we have the the loss of the Exarchate of Ravenna. And the Exarchate of Ravenna, as we discussed on our other streams, leads to the donations of Pepin, which is the idea that the former possessions of the Exarchate are now the temporal possessions of the Pope in compensation. So yes, this all happens around this time. But back to iconoclasm, the traditional assumption advocated by Arnold J. Toynbee, who's one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, is that iconoclasm is associated with an attempt to emulate the Muslims in their, again, Muslims who explicitly ban all images of the Prophet Muhammad. But when it comes, I mean, this is quite an interesting debate in itself, because
so in what way would you, in a sense of perhaps one of the reasons why the Muslims are being so successful is because they have this
yes,
I suppose, more pure and zealous view, and so we need
yes,
to imitate that if we want
yes,
victory. I see.
Yes,
I see.
and it's a constant.
It's very much a channeling of like a puritanical streak of believing that these people are sort of paying excessive credence to icons rather than God.
Or even more than that, you can say it's the veneration of images as opposed to austere living, as exemplified by martial cultures, military cultures, of which the Arabs at this time were the apex. And I think this,
and let's face it, this is seen also in Byzantine churches everywhere from Sicily to the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and even Antioch. We know that Byzantine churches are extremely opulent even for this time period.
Yes, and one of the effects of this is many of the mosaics are, destroyed, as you can see in the middle image here. Most of the mosaics we actually have are, for example, in Ravenna, areas which had, resisted the iconoclastic fury. Much of that art is destroyed. But I think this is more than just an attack on icons. This is an attack on, you can say, the position of women in power, because iconodualism was associated with the powerful positions of women. And as we'll see later on, it's actually female regents and the regnant Empress Irene who are responsible for bringing back the iconodual position of the empire. But also it's an attack on monasteries, because the monasteries were attacked as being these venerators of these holy images. So you can say there is a little bit of Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries here. So much so that, if anyone's interested in Crimean history, because it's got a unique and fascinating history, we have all of these wonderful cave monasteries, dotted throughout Crimea, which had again been the place of exile, as we mentioned. And many of these, the legend goes, these were iconodules, monks, seeking refuge from the iconoclastic fury of the emperor. I think just in terms of like trying to establish the iconoclastic line, obviously this goes back to thou shalt not worship graven images, the idea of worshiping the calf.
Daniel and idol worship.
Yes, exactly. But there are two other factors. One is the idea that Christ is actually demeaned by the depiction of an image, apparently because art cannot characterize his triple nature. It cannot characterize his divine and his human natures. Therefore, the images of Christ themselves are in some way reducing Christ. They're limiting Christ.
I would argue in response to that point that no words can also accurately represent the majesty of God,
Yes, and I think that's also very belittling towards Byzantine art at the same time. So that's, again, this is the arguments, the iconoclast arguments. And one, of course, is the increase in fetishism, i.e. the worship of the object, worship of the image, and not worship of what the image or the object nominally represents, which again is this... Sorry,
I was just going to also say, in addition to your point about the hint of Henry VIII, for people who perhaps aren't aware, we do have real money troubles. I mean, you've mentioned the constant donatives that are going out to barbarian groups and soldiers, and so there's a strong impetus whenever an emperor comes along. I need cash. I need it now. I need to strengthen up my base of support. How am I going to do it? There's a church over there full of gold,
Yes, exactly.
Let's do it.
Yes, this is a you can say a cash a massive cash
piggy bank.
Piggy bank, which has been again used for the purposes of moral purification. But yes, this is, you can say again, this is the Byzantine Empire trying to adopt a far more warlike posture. And this isn't I think in terms of like coming up with armies, one of the comparisons I think of is actually Charles XII, the famous Swedish king, the Protestant ethic and his teetotaler army, and the fact that none of these vices were permitted. This idea of a puritanical martial culture under the emperor, I think this is what the Asorians emulated, and you can say they succeeded, because this is going to come back later on when we talk about the second iconoclastic period, because there are two, and there's a little in between period before.
And Leo himself, because he's called Leo the Assorian, but he's also called Leo the Syrian. And so was he, are those terms synonymous? Because if he's from Syria, if he's from the Levant, then maybe he has some experience of this, attitude amongst the Muslims and the Arabs.
I haven't heard Leo the Third. I think Leo the Third, is it Leo the Fourth, the Syrian? Unless I'm terribly confused, or Leo the Fifth. I think it's Leo the Fifth is potentially the Syrian emperor, not Leo the Third. Leo the Fifth I might be wrong, but there are 3 Leos during this.
Oh no,
period.
here we go. See, Leo the Third, the Assyrian, also known as the Syrian.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how he would get both epithets. How it could be 2 nationalities like that. But yes, I think there are a lot of things to talk about. On the one hand, he ushered in this iconoclastic fury. Yet on the other hand, he was militarily successful, and you could say he did bring back the empire from the brink, even though it also resulted in a loss of territory, nominally the ex-Archate of Ravenna. And his son, Constantine V, these emperors reigned for an incredibly long time, considering the 20 Years Anarchy before. Leo rules for nearly 25 years, and Constantine V rules for 34 years. So these are successful emperors. Their reigns have great longevity to them, and they're both fervent iconoclasts, and they're able. Constantine V in particular is able to successfully secure the borders of the empire against the Bulgarians, establishing some form of stable border. And I think when we come to the history of them, much of the history is written by the iconodules who are coming at the beginning of the Macedonian dynasty, when we begin to see the rebirth of this literary culture again.
Yeah, with Porphyrogenitus and what have you.
Exactly. And this is where we have the historical record of these emperors. And of course, it's coincidingly damning, because many of these writers had iconodule sympathies. But nevertheless, I think it is important to undermine that despite their iconoclastic tendencies, the emperors were able to consolidate and bring the empire back from the brink.
I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, because I would argue, it seems obvious to me that the reason why they were so militarily successful is because they had loads of money. From this policy, you could pay your troops, you could equip your troops, you could supply them more easily. What have you?
Well, it's beyond that. It's not just the monetary gains. It's also the idea permeated so beyond the idea of the army as some sort of iconoclastic, zealous puritanical army under an iconoclastic emperor. I see. It created this puritanical element, which caused Constantine V to be venerated. I mean, I was going to mention this later, but I'll bring it up now. When Leo V restored iconoclasm in the second period, after the collapse of the reign of Nicephorus, iconoclasm was again associated so much with military success that after the defeats of the Bulgarians under Khan Krum, soldiers actually opened the sarcophagus of Emperor Constantine V and prayed to him to restore the emperor, as he'd been so associated with this military success. And of course, he was also one of the principal iconoclastic emperors at the same time. So the military
prayed to him as a saint.
Yes. So the military affiliation with this is more so than that. They wanted him to come back from the dead, like the idea of the marble emperor returning to secure his kingdom. So
it was a very superstitious time. That's something else you notice. Extreme it's just a bizarre period. And I'm sorry guys, but these are not Romans in the way that we knew them. Okay, this is some bizarre bastardized successor. It seems obvious to me, but hey ho.
Well, again, I've disputed that, because this, despite the religious controversies, of course, the original empire was pagan, as it should be mentioned, but that itself was, imported mainly from Etruscan civilizations and ancient Greek polytheism. So I think what the consistent argument, which I think myself and Marcus make, is the fact that regardless of the major cultural innovations in the empire, Christianity being the biggest cultural innovation of the empire during this entire period of perhaps its entire history, is that from beginning of the overthrow of Tarquinius all the way up until the sack of Constantinople in 1204, we have a continuous legal continuity, which is remarkable, and it shouldn't be understated how the idea that you can have a continuously existing state for nearly 2,000 years is truly incredible. Almost nothing else, I think, exists like it in history. Even in China, we see the collapse of one regime and the rise of a new regime adopting a mantle of heaven. A mantle of heaven is not a continuous legal tradition, which Rome has, a continuity of office holders like Rome has. I think that's what makes
it alongside a bureaucratic and administrative continuity as well.
I mean, I don't deny that there's continuity, but I guess to my Catholic self, what I see is the Byzantine Empire in the east, and then the Church in the west, and when the west takes everything that's good about Rome, and the east seems to take everything that's bad.
Well, I think this is a very short period. I think needs to be stated, because we go from this. Marcus, you have one remark you want to make about Leo III quickly, but after that, I'll get on to Irene.
Yeah, sure. I'll just to quickly address what Columba just said. We also have to consider, and I touched on that in my essay when I sort of used the terminology that I did about it being sort of essentially events beyond imagination of the modern mind, that we have to consider that these are events the East Romans have lived through a century of catastrophe, which would be sort of possibly, a European who lived through the world wars could potentially compare to what this was. You've lived in a highly sophisticated, civilized society which has been brought down to its knees. You've seen 2/3 of the landmass of your empire vanish in the face of an enemy, and then at the tail end of that period, just to say your bureaucracy and your army starting to be rebuilt, you're then enduring this internal fracturing at the religious heart of an extremely religious empire populated with highly religious people tearing itself from within. Let's keep that in mind. But yes, just on the Leo the Assorian thing, Leo was born in Germanicaea, which is modern day the East Turkish city of Marash, which is sort of near, not far from modern day Sanliurfa, which is I'm trying to think what the ancient name for that is. It's not Amida, it's
Adana.
Not Adana. No.
So
Anyway,
is this sort of north of Syria?
So you're talking the borderlands between Syria and Turkey, right?
Okay, got you.
But why he's also called the Assyrians, because he's appointed the strategos of the Anatolic theme. And although the capital of the Anatolic theme is Amorion essentially used as a second capital after Constantinople by the by the Phrygian sort of Assorian dynasties, because it's a very wealthy city during this time period. And so the strategos of the Anatolic theme, and also because the threats of that theme of the empire coming from the east, tend to place themselves at the southeastern end of this theme, which lies in the province of Assoria. So I would suggest that the title has to do with the fact that Assoria would have made up the predominant area of his command, because it's actually because it's Leo. Sorry, go on.
After you. I was just gonna say so is this right on the border with the caliphate?
Yeah. So the Anatolic theme and the Armeniaic theme are the big before they add themes later on with the conquest of Eastern Anatolia. The Anatolic and Armeniaic theme are the bulwark against the Arabs, and it's actually Leo in conjunction with the strategos of the Armeniaic theme. I think it was Artabasdos who conspire to dethrone the Emperor Theodosius III. So I think that's where the Assyrian epithet would come from, with the fact that he was essentially the area commander of Assyria.
This would make sense.
And based there, yeah. Sorry, that's me. I am.
No, thank you for clearing that up, Marcus. We come to one of the most remarkable figures of Byzantine history, which is Irene. Just for context, she was married to Leo IV, who is relatively remarkable and short-reigned, only reigned from 775 until 780. As former consort of Leo IV, Irene is now empress mother to the young Constantine VI, who is in his minority. And from this period, so from about 780 until 790, she rules as a queen mother, virtually uncontested. And it's during this time that we have the convening of the Second Council of Nicaea. We have a later Russian image in the East, but, the triumph of the iconodules, which condemns iconoclasm and ends the first iconoclast period. And this is, an interesting rhyme, as something very similar is going to happen with the second period. So weirdly, we have the situation where, an empress, with hidden iconodual sympathies, is the one again bringing the empire back. But I think in terms of her infamy throughout history, she's also known for what she did to her son, Constantine VI. Constantine VI, who would reach his majority during the 790s. Constantine VI, who would rightfully try and assert his position as emperor, in response to a series of rebellions led by him against his mother. He is essentially blinded, but worse than that, it's the mauling of his eyes actually results in him dying from this process. So he's actually murdered by his mother Irene, and in response, Irene makes herself the first empress regnant of the Byzantine Empire in 797. And just to put this in perspective, there have been many powerful women in the Eastern Roman Empire. There, of course, been Pulcheria, the sister of Emperor Theodosius II, who was basically made honorifically the emperor, even though she didn't ever hold sole power. We have Theodora, of course, the consort of Justinian I. We had Martina, of course, the consort of the Emperor Heraclius, who have been, incredibly influential, history would say for the worse in terms of his reign, and also trying to, impose her own son and potentially murder Heraclius's other son. But, never before had an empress actually reached, this pinnacle of power in her own right in terms of like other equivalents during this time. Roughly at the same time, there's something almost identical happens in China, which is we have the usurpation of, I think it's maybe 100 years before, we have the usurpation of the Tang dynasty by Wu Zetian, who in a very similar fashion usurped her own son and placed herself on the throne at the head of her own dynasty in the same way. So interesting that both of these things will be happening, at a rather similar time. But this is not only is she, instrumental in bringing to end the iconoclastic controversy, and you can say feminizing the empire after its, original sort of martial glory, but we have the coronation of Charlemagne at the same time in 800 on the pretext that Irene was, illegitimate because no woman could ever hold the
I guess they didn't love her pro-icon policy enough. I guess. Well, that's
the major irony, isn't it? That we finally have an empress who is more in keeping with the sympathies, the intellectual sympathy, spiritual sympathies of them. Well, it's not just that. I think again this emphasizes the fact that the popes fall from grace, from the east. The division was both political and spiritual, and it just so happened under Leo the Assorian that it happened at the same time. Leo was both incapable of holding on, protecting the Pope in the Exarchate of Ravenna, yet he was also spiritually, complete opposition to the Pope. When we get to Irene, the Exarchate of Ravenna had dissolved. Pepin was now the Carolingians, now Charlemagne were the guarantors for this state. And Irene essentially had no role, again, in exerting any sort of significant military presence over the Pope, other than from her ever diminishing possessions in the south of Italy. As we mentioned in our previous stream, Marcus, on Sicily, we were talking about the Byzantine remnants in Sicily and Apulia and Calabria. So therefore, it's obvious that the Pope therefore decides to switch his allegiance definitively to Charlemagne. Even though we don't have the Great Schism yet, the Great Schism doesn't happen until 1054. We don't have the great division of Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism.
But there are all sorts of stories about her outrageous way of life. Apparently she would ride on a gold chariot drawn by 4 white horses down the street, and what have you.
Well, I think I'm slightly critical of this because I think and if Irene was so
one could understand the political motivation.
Yes, if Irene was so extravagant and incompetent, it's very unlikely that so many courtiers would have been able to side against with her against her own son Constantine VI, who arguably would have been easier to control. But saying that, the irony is that Irene is actually overthrown by one of her ministers, one Nicephorus, her finance minister, who becomes the first emperor of the Nicephorian dynasty, which is very short-lived. But he carries out a series of reforms, and we have this the you could say the controversy now that the empire has a male ruler again after only 2 years of having a female emperor, and now we have two emperors, not in the sense that we have a Western emperor and the Eastern emperor, although we do have in the most literal geographic sense. We have two emperors claiming supreme universal Roman authority, and both essentially are not recognizing the authority of the other. But this is where we get to the second iconoclastic period, and I would say the association with iconoclasm and military success, because
and a slightly nicer looking map.
Yes, and as you can see, there's a slight consolidation here. And what you can say, the after effect of the reign of the Assyrians is all of these extraneous provinces. During the 7th century map, we have provinces dotted all across the north coast of Africa. We have provinces in Spain. We have little provinces in the north of Italy. And of course, we have that horrific state of affairs where the entirety of the inland of the Balkans is basically controlled by Slavic and Bulgarian tribes. Here we have a more compact, more consolidated empire with far more definitive borders, which is able to defend itself. Nevertheless, with the decline of the Assorian Dynasty, we have the rise of military calamity again. I've already sort of slightly alluded to this. Nicephorus suffers a major military setback at the Battle of Krassos against the Abbasids. Just for reference, for people who forget, the Umayyads are overthrown in the course of the middle of the 8th century, and they're replaced by the Abbasids after the Abbasid revolution. And they will become, the principal Muslim power in the region until, you could say, a very long process of decline over 400 years, where you have these various Turkish fiefdoms and later Turkish principalities, then the great Turkish Empire, Seljuk Empire under Alp Arslan. But the Abbasids are now the principal opponents to the Byzantines in the east, whilst the Bulgarians are now again the principal powers to the north. The Bulgarians are able to decisively defeat the later Nicephorian emperor, Michael Nicephoros, in the Battle of Varosinkia, and this is at the hands of Khan Krum. And this is where I mentioned we have that episode where the soldiers open the sarcophagus of the former emperor Constantine V, and implore him to come back and restore the empire. In fact, the situation of the empire was so dire after this, you could say, almost a century of consolidation, that the only way that Constantinople potentially avoided being sieged and perhaps even taken by land was that Khan Krum died in 814, leading to a brief succession war within the Bulgarian Empire. And we have the rise of Leo V, who doesn't establish his own dynasty, yet we have many significant actions taken as reign. One is a long-term peace established between the Bulgarians, establishing, again, a more definitive set of borders. The other is the return to iconoclasm. And again, from my mind, the most obvious reason for this is this, as you mentioned, on the other hand, Columba, is this desire to raise, quick resources in the face of a military threat. But from Leo V's point of view, we have the legacy of the iconoclastic emperors. We have two emperors, Leo III and Constantine V, who had lived long, distinguished reigns. And then ever since we have the return to the iconodules, the iconodules back in power, we have the gouging of the eyes of Constantine VII. We have the deposition of Empress Irene in 802 to Lesbos. We have the death of Emperor Nicephorus on campaign, and now we have the death of Michael as well.
So there's this idea of wanting to avoid sort of unfortunate associations.
Yes, okay. And it's the iconoclastic emperors are the ones associated with this military success, especially against the Bulgarians. And the iconodule emperors are again considered, you can almost say superstitiously, this the unnatural deaths could have resulted from this again dramatic change in the religious position. And but I think what's important to note is that this didn't have the desired effect. Leo V died of failure, and he was in fact murdered by Michael II the Amorian. And the resumption of iconoclasm didn't stop the fall of Crete again. And as we talked about in our last stream together, Marcus, from 8 to 8 onwards, we have the slow conquest of Sicily. Even though it's a long process, again, this is just removing the last vestiges of Byzantine authority in the West at the same time. This begins under the reign of Emperor Michael II.
And that's one thing to take from this map is, if I may just briefly interject, here, you see that eastern portion of Sicily has been conquered by the Arabs. That would include the capture of Palermo, and also what would have been ancient Lilybaeum, which is modern day Marsala, right on the eastern tip. And another thing, I wanted to raise this because it's contingent and sort of relevant to our discussion about Bulgarians and what you might define as their ethnogenesis. As a Balkan people is, although the Byzantines, the Eastern Empire, has reconquered much of the Aegean coastline. It's consolidated through what you could call central Greece, through Epirus. Dyrrhachium has been sort of reconnected to the mainland. There's a more sort of solid continuous border sitting along the southern Rhodope Mountains. Tellingly, that northern portion of Thrace that runs along the Black Sea coast has been lost to the Bulgarians. And during Krum's campaigns against the Byzantines at this time, he captures a number of cities along the coast, namely Marcianopolis, Varna, Mesembria, and Archelos. And it's actually him, in a similar way to as the Mongols would do much later, and to some degree which the Turks also did to a smaller degree, is the relocation of these people into the Bulgarian homeland. And because these cities were quite certainly the more Hellenized part of what was Roman Moesia, they have a profound influence on Bulgarian society and on their culture and language, and coinciding with the missionary work done by Saints Kyrillios and Methodios. This transforms to some degree, or is a part of the transformation of the Bulgarians within their own nation.
Well, no, well, thank you very much for that. I think in terms of like setting it up, I think what's significant about the Bulgarians from originally, it must be emphasized, a formerly nomadic people, which, only a couple of, during the time of the reign of Asparuh and the great old Bulgaria, have basically been nothing more than the tribal confederation. They quickly set up their own permanent capital. The legend is that it was begun under Asparuh, even though that's disputed because the archaeology isn't there. If you go to modern day Pliska in Bulgaria today, it's actually quite well preserved. They're even trying to restore parts of the old palace, which again have been modelled after the Great Palace in Constantinople. Very much what we see, during the 8th and the 9th centuries is this consolidation of a nation state, a Bulgarian nation state, a Bulgarian empire, which even in some cases rivals the power. I mean, in terms of the consolidation of territory, not only does Bulgaria under Krum rule over modern Bulgaria, as you can see on this map, but it also rules over most of Pannonia as well, and most of modern day Romania as well. So it's a major contending power. However, in terms of the limitations of Byzantine influence, Krum and his predecessors, of course, were all pagan, and we still haven't arrived at this point of Christianization. I don't think it also helps that the empire is racked with these internal divisions. And I think in terms of grandeur, one of the effects of the iconodual position is that you can say a religious policy based around grandeur, based around the beauty, the inspiration of these works under again the manifest of trying to venerate God, is a very good way of bringing people into some form of, again, cultural assimilation or cultural adoration with Byzantium. And this isn't a phase that we're going to see until the reign of Michael III, the last Mauryan emperor, and the beginning of the reign of Basil I, the founder of the Macedonian dynasty. So this empire in flux, you can say the iconoclastic nature of this time, I think it actually impedes the growth of Christianity in this period and the growth of Byzantification into the Bulgarian Empire. Ironically, at the same time where many of these iconoclastic emperors adopt iconoclasm as a means of dealing with the Bulgarians. Ironically, it's conquered through Christianity. And I think when we talk about Theophilos, who is the last iconoclastic emperor, again, none of the second iconoclastic emperors, would be the Leo V or Michael II or Theophilos, had been successfully emulated Leo III or Constantine V. Most of his military successes, were against the Arabs, but namely that was just holding on to this frontier, this rather stable frontier, which corresponds to the Armenian highlands and the Syrian boundaries. When it comes to the west, we have the emergence of a separate Serbian polity under Prince Vlastimir. And I think it's in the late 830s and the early 840s, we have a series of Serbian-Bulgarian wars, which, pit, I think the then Khan is Khan Plessian against Vlastimir, and Vlastimir actually successfully defeats them and tentatively, switches his allegiance towards Byzantium when things are doing badly, and then becomes more independent because he doesn't actually have to rely on them. So the Bulgarians are actually worn down not by Byzantine encroachments, but also by divisions within the Slavic nations themselves. I mean, this is the same time where we also see Croatia emerging as a distinct polity at the same time. I mean, in the north, we have Greater Moravia, which is, probably the largest of all these Slavic states beside the Bulgarian Empire, which hadn't, up until that point, again, been the Bulgars are fully assimilated into, the Slavic population. But there's a military point you want to bring up, Marcus, so would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, just very quickly, because we've obviously covered the establishment and the definition of the themes and the tagma and what have you. But what we see in this sort of next century, in this century from say the mid 700s, 750 to 850, which is when we have this map. And although it is interceded by these Byzantine defeats at the hands of the Bulgarians, and namely Pliska, which is an absolute catastrophe. It's where Nicephorus I has his skull turned into a drinking cup by Crum, and what we
Crum sounds
there,
like a bit of a Chad.
Yeah, despite a crummy name, he's most certainly a Chad in this respect.
Oh, that's awful.
It is. Pardon me. Sorry, guys. But it's actually at these two battles where we see the initial destruction of these tagma, which was so sort of painstakingly built up and developed from Justinian II's reign onwards, because the first tagma, to my knowledge, and from what I've read, the first sort of tagma that were established were the excubitores, which is the translated as the sentinels, and the scholae palatinae were an evolution from the 4th century scholae that the Romans established in their unified state and sort of continued into existence throughout this period. And they were quite indispensable in the first and second sieges of Constantinople. And when you look at this map here, you see this gradual consolidation and strengthening of the borders and a slight a strengthening of the state, and that is an indication of this empire getting it together militarily. Even though it's lost Africa, Sicily's been invaded, and that will be lost in the next century. The Byzantines are now getting a hang of fighting the Arabs and actually score successes against them, and we see this throughout the initially with the Assorian Dynasty, and then later through the Phrygian Amorian Dynasty, and through to the Macedonians, who under a number of emperors score victories actually both east and in the west, and in the north against even the Bulgars later on. But the defeats at the hands of Crum really destroy that initial establishment of the tagma, because we see almost the complete destruction of the hikonatoi, for instance, and the scholae and the excubitores. They're almost killed to a man. So we sort of see this later expansion. The numeroi are later established in the midst of this disaster, and the tagmas are eventually rebuilt. And they actually the Byzantines do learn some important military lessons from the Bulgarian wars, which become indispensable in them eventually triumphing over the Bulgars, under the infamous Bulgar Oktonos. I just thought that was important because you have this gradual evolution here, and this sort of century is very important to that.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that, Marcus. Yes, I think just one final point before we get to really an epilogue on this discussion is we have, as you can see on this left icon, we have Michael III, and again, very similar, eerily similar. We have the Empress Theodora, the Queen Mother, who doesn't end up murdering her son, but nevertheless is responsible.
Oh, good.
That's a happy deviation from the rhyme. But yes, Michael III, with Theodora officiating over it, who basically rules the empire for the first 15 years of his reign, brings back the the iconodule position, restores the icons, and this is the end of the iconoclastic controversies during this period. Definitively ending. So I think ending this period of religious fanaticism, which you associated Columba with, like deviating from the Catholic traditions in Rome. Ironically, we have a restoration of these traditions during this point at a time where Rome is no longer having to be dependent on the emperor, and the unity of the episcopacy, the bishops, is broken, and now we have a divided authority. Nevertheless, we have the restoration of the icons, and we have some stability as well. However, Michael III is quite interesting. He's the last emperor we're going to discuss in this conversation. Michael III was the last of the Amorian emperors until he's actually deposed by Basil I, who had briefly been his co-emperor before that point. Much of the history, as I mentioned, is contemporaneous. It's around this time, the later 9th century, just after the reign of Michael III. And Michael III is known as Michael the Drunkard to posterity. I think this is a lot to do with Macedonians, who are the ascendant dynasty for 200 years, probably the most successful of all of the East Roman dynasties in the empire's history, are responsible for doing a little act of historical butchery on the character. Because when we look at the Arab sources, Michael III is known as a militarily effective emperor, but much of what we know is due to his licentiousness, almost as a post hoc justification for justifying his deposition by Basil, who would later become one of the more effective emperors. And then we enter the Byzantine Golden Age, which is really the topic for the next stream. So
and
I think
plays into the namesake of the dynasty as well, because what we also see, I don't know if you're going to mention this, but they're called both the Phrygian and the Amorian dynasty concurrently, and it's actually during this time period. I think it's pretty sure it's in Michael III's reign where the Arabs actually assemble a punitive attack against the empire in quite sizable force, and they capture and sack Amorion, and that's sort of considered in some ways in how do I describe it, an ideological defeat for iconoclasm. It's a disendorsement for the dynasty and that particular ideological regime, and the iconodules use that as quite the weapon to rewrite the past in their favor.
Absolutely, and I think
can I ask a question about the accession of Basil, because I might be getting it confused. Is it Basil who is invited by Theodora to take out Michael, or is that later with Theophanu? Because I get confused.
I'm not quite sure about that. What I was quite fascinated by was that Michael III actually forced Basil to marry his mistress. Michael's mistress, in order to try and facilitate a better bonding between the family.
I love that. That's great.
But no, yes, he was made co-emperor for a year before eventually murdering Michael, which is, well, I'm not sure what the moral of the story is there, but
par for the course.
But yes, the Amorian dynasty is very strange in the sense that they are trying to emulate the success of the Assorians, fail miserably, and then the last and probably the most effective emperor is lost to posterity due to him being overshadowed by the much more successful dynasty that succeeded him. But I think the final, more happy note I want to end this discussion on is the effect of this. You could say the beginning of the restoration of the culture of Byzantium after the iconoclastic period, which leads to the cultural conquest of the Slavs, if not the military conquest of the Slavs. That's going to happen much later, some 2 centuries after this period. So by 850, we have the reign of Khan Boris. And as I mentioned, we see a increasingly sedentary empire. And at the same time, in 855, we have Saint Cyril or Saint Cyrilius or Saint Methodius, known as to posterity as the apostles of the Slavs, introducing the Byzantine Slavic rite, or the Old Slavonic liturgy, and the Glagolithic alphabet, which is essentially the precursor to the Cyrillic alphabet in some senses, although the Cyrillic alphabet was actually patronized much later under the reign of the Tsar of Bulgaria, Simeon, at his court in in Pliska, using the Preslav Literary School. What is the significance of this? Significance of this is, on the one hand, you have the creation of a Slavic religious tradition, which is independent from the Latin rites and the Greek rites, which makes it rather significant, but also a language and alphabet which is distinctively and unmistakably Slavic is going to be emerging by the 10th century. Even though the Glagolithic alphabet falls into disuse and it's used sparingly during the medieval period, it's later replaced by the Cyrillic alphabet. Ironically, we have the Christianization of the Bulgarians, we have the Christianization of the Moravians, we have the Christianization of the Serbians, and much later on we're going to have the Christianization of the Poles, and we're going to have the Christianization of the Rus peoples. The Rus peoples who periodically are entering the political scene for the first time and launch an attack on Constantinople, which fails during the same period. This ironically allows for Byzantium to culturally penetrate into these regions, bringing them under the sway of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And what's noted is that Boris was, continuously trying to see, the advantages of whether he sides with the Pope or whether he sides with the Emperor. And the advantage of siding with the Emperor in terms of this, top-down conversion of the now Empire of Bulgaria is that it's allowed basically a peace process to continue, a 30-year peace, after the wars which have been started by Crom, allowing the Byzantines to cede certain territory to Bulgaria in return for this new affiliation. And but whilst at the same time you can say this is a Byzantine cultural conquest, at the same time you're creating a liturgy which is very difficult to allow for the assimilation of other cultures. So the Slavs now have their own language, they now have their own liturgy, and the Byzantines are still using, the Greek Byzantine Latin, the Greek Byzantine Rite. And so ironically, it's going to embolden and create an independent sense of Slav identity, despite the fact it's also an ideological coup for the Byzantines at the same time. It's a double-edged sword.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because I mean, I watched the last stream and with this as well, and with what I know now, because I had never fully understood, the sort of the Russian claim of being, the heir to Byzantium. I had a rough idea, but it's fascinating when you consider this, this cultural outpouring and the creation of, an Eastern European, a recognizably Eastern European culture, I suppose. And then when you consider what comes later with the Ottoman conquest and the sort of the heart of this Byzantine culture is cut off and subjected, the torch begins to be carried by the Russians and by the Eastern Europeans. And so it is fascinating, and there's a very powerful argument there which I hadn't fully understood.
Absolutely, and this process, begins in the 9th century. This is the critical time where we see, the emergence of, Slavic civilization, Slavic Christian civilization, and the expansion of the Orthodox Commonwealth as we know it today. And to my mind, really the true definition between Eastern European and Western European along these Orthodox and these Catholic lines.
It's also at this time, I believe. I can't remember which dynasty exactly, but in the 10th century or the 9th century, one of the princesses of the royal house was, I believe, married to a Russian, or at least Gibbon describes him as a Russian, which might be a bit inaccurate terminology, but a man of the Rus, some noble. So it's interesting. You see this in a dynastic sense as well, and in a blood sense, these connections as well.
Yes, you brought up a key sort of principle of later Byzantine diplomacy, which is you can say the diplomatic marriage is really pioneered by Byzantium. Although I really want to leave this for next stream, where we really get into the dynamics of the court, the Book of Ceremonies, and we talk about the Golden Age of Byzantium. So if it's all right with you two, and there aren't any more comments you'd like to bring up, I'll get to super chats if that's all right.
One last thing I would say is that I believe the princess who was sent off to the east, her sister famously married, I believe, Otto in the west, or a relative of Otto, and so it's a part of their strategy. But that's me.
Absolutely. So Sam Peter for $6.99 Canadian dollars. Thank you very much. My tithe and my blessing may be as all-seeing as Vasil Bulgatonos, and as victorious as Heraclius, and as hygienic as Vladimir of Kiev.
Well, I don't understand the last part, but I assume it's clever.
Right. Marcos 588 for 450 Australian dollars. And no super chats. Well, you do now. Fine work, lads. Well, 2 super chats, and we have a third here. Hunger for $5. Thoughts on the idea the Arabs preserved ancient Greek texts? Is it Muslim Enlightenment propaganda to erase Byzantium, or is there some truth in it? It's a bit of both.
It's a bit of both, yeah.
Obviously, Byzantium did hold on to this rich literary heritage throughout this entire time. And when we look at the Crusades weren't just the, it also happens, Toledo is often cited by academics as the great, you could say, moment in the Reconquista, where you have like the beginnings of the later Renaissance of Western civilization. I think it's also important to note that at the same time, so we're talking the Communion Restoration, we're talking the 11th century, we also have far more interaction, and this also coincides with the discussion we were having last time, Marcus, the growth of the maritime republics, the massive expansion of maritime shipping, and the context, not just with the East, but with the Byzantine Empire at the same time. So both of these forces were exceptional in the facilitation. But I think it's also important to note that the Arabs didn't find all of the Greek sources interesting. I mean, they mainly focused on, what was practical, what would, advance their
logical works, scientific works.
Yes. So, the House of Wisdom, they were more advanced in terms of like practical sciences in many ways. But Byzantium
and things like that, they were quite good as well.
Yes, and medicine. So Byzantium was, you can say, the holder of the great literary canon of
the humanities, we might say.
Yes, exactly.
So, even despite their remarkable lack of humanity, which I think we might have covered quite well here.
There was a comment I did actually wish to canvass, because it was directed at me, and it was by Ionas Palaiologos, if I may address it. And he said that the Legio system was finally disbanded after the Arab invasions as well. And I mean, yes, we did cover that with the establishment of the Thermata and the imperial tagmata at the capital. But one thing to consider is, even though we have a disintegration and collapse of both the military and the civil bureaucratic administration of the West, in the East, and it is hard to say, because in the dominant period, we have the extensive use of the Velaxiones. So we have these legions can be sort of sent to several places around the empire at once, even though they sort of have the same host legion. But in the case of, say, the fifth Macedonica, which is a famous example, that legion was raised in 43 BC and is attested to exist. If you look into the Notitiata Dignitatum, the fifth Macedonica is still deployed near Kalinikos in eastern Syria in 637 AD.
Yeah, it's a similar situation in Egypt. Yeah, there was a legion in Egypt too.
Yeah. And just looking, if I mean, you can go on Wikipedia, they've got a list of legions and what have you. I mean, you have the 10th Fretensis, 10 Gemina, the 11th Claudia, the 12th Fulminata. They're all attested to existing beyond 400 AD. And it's the vast majority, or certainly a sizable number of these existent legions, whether in totality or in fragment, that exist in the East and are deployed in the East, with the onset of first the Sassanid invasion, but then lastly with the Arab invasion, these units are essentially destroyed in this time period. But it's when AM referenced before that you have this continuation from sort of Tarquinius to 1204. There's also this quite amazing continuation of military units that extends for half a millennia. It's quite amazing when you consider that.
You can imagine, or I like to imagine what it must have been like. I imagine there might have been a hint of the the 40K Space Marine chapters. Hundreds of years of history. You have an identity there. You'd probably have stories of the unit, and it's fascinating to think about.
I mean, imagine, being, I can't remember if it was the 13th or was this the 7th, which legion was it that had the bull icon, which was given to it after the Battle of Thapsus. Not the bull, the elephant icon, because it, destroyed the Scipio's elephants at the Battle of Thapsus, and it retained those colors and those symbols for hundreds of years. I mean,
I always had a soft spot for the Fulminata, for anyone who's not a big Latin guy, that's the Thundering Legion, which is a fantastic name.
Or potentially Lightning Throwers.
The Lightning, yes, the Lightning Legion, yes.
I'm assuming we're at the end of this stream, AM, but can I, because we've talked about the Arab invasions, we spoke about them last week and this week, I have a small little linguistic reference it's kind of unrelated to everything, but it's because we've talked a bit about language. Do you mind if I read this paragraph?
Sure, it could be a nice cap off of this
Certainly.
conversation. So go ahead.
Indeed. Now, for those who do follow me on Twitter, you'll see one thing I have on there is ex-chef. So I like to make references that pertain to food. And there's an interesting book here that I've got a book here, and I recommend anyone who's into culture and things of this ilk to buy this. It's called Taste of Byzantium, The Cuisine of a Legendary Empire by Andrew Dalby. And it makes a really interesting reference about how language within Byzantium changes in this this period from, say, the 7th century to the 10th century. And here I'll start from this top of this paragraph. The most famous of these great aromatics, balsam of Mecca, the resin of the Commiforia opalbalsamum, also produced within Byzantine frontiers, but only down to the time of the earliest Islamic conquest in the 11th century. This is because, although it is native to southern Arabia, there had been plantations of the precious tree in Egypt and in Palestine. The latter very ancient and associated with the legend with the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon. Palestine, in fact, became the main economic source for balsam of Mecca to the Roman Empire. Pierre Bellon, the last recorded observer of the manufacture of fish oils in Constantinople, was also the last person who saw balsam growing at Matarea or Al-Mataria near Cairo. Merchants told him that this was transplanted and maintained at Cairo at great cost and trouble, and that the ordinary trade balsam all came from the Arabian Peninsula, which is evidence that by his time the balsam groves of Palestine were a thing of the past. Perhaps they were finally ruled by the Crusades, perhaps by the Islamic invasions centuries before. However that may be, balsam of Mecca came to Constantinople from Muslim territory after the 7th century, which explains why the book of the epoch written around 895 refers to balsam under its Arabic name barzan, which was evidently by then the normal trade term for this within the empire, instead of the classical Greek term of balsamon. The latter word certainly remained familiar because of its use in the Bible, but eventually ceased to have specific everyday meaning in trade, commerce, and consumption.
That's interesting.
And
I thought when you mentioned fish oil, I thought you were going to talk about garum for a second.
No, so I mean, I would hope that that excerpt will probably be nowhere else on YouTube. And I know it's a little bit unrelated to everything we've spoken about regarding to war and religion, but I thought that was a really nice reference of a linguistic change from this sort of Near Eastern portion of the world, Syria, the Levant, Egypt, this transition from a Hellenic Roman sphere to an Arabic Islamic one, and how even terms used within East Rome morph with that. I just thought it was an interesting little insight, so I hope you liked it.
Very interesting. No, I love that. I love tracking food. We should try and track the end of Romanitas through garum. I wonder what the last reference to the fish of the legions.
Tracing Greco-Roman linguistics through balsamon and garum. Great.
I love it. Okay, well, AM's message in the chat. Apparently, his internet's playing up, so he's asked me to finish up. So, thank you, Marcus, for your... I will do the shilling. I have no shilling apart from my article coming up in the illustrious men's magazine Man's World. I'm gonna be writing about the right. No, but we're gonna be writing about the some of the misconceptions that I suppose the Bapists, if we want to call them that, have about certain of them have about Christianity. They characterize it as this weak feminine religion. So we're going to talk about Clovis and Julius II and Cabeza de Vaca, who was a priest in the New World, which should be interesting. I encourage you all to read the magazine. You don't have to read my article, but there's loads of interesting stuff in there. Marcus, have you got anything to shill?
No, that's about it. Actually, I sort of shot my special what would you call it, sort of fireworks for the crowd with that last excerpt. So I'm good.
Well, I will
the the only thing I will say is, because I did, you weren't here, Columba, but me and my family, we did olive picking last week, and we're in the process of bottling it. So if anyone's in tune and wants to catch pics of it on my Twitter, I should have photos up in the next couple of weeks of genuine Italo-Australian olive oil. So
some
stay
delicious
tuned.
first pressing. Yes. All right.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess thank you to all of the patrons. Your support is invaluable. And I guess
Chats,
we
the
will
comments, the community. Thank you, everyone.
all of it. We love it. All right. Well, I guess we're signing off. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'm not really sure how to end the broadcast, so this could be an issue. But I suppose we're just gonna have to go.
Good night, everyone. Take care.
All right. Bye, everyone.